Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm very excited about this conversation today. We have two experts whose new book is Bridging the Gap when it comes to providing information and tools for a Christian audience on recognizing and tackling Islamophobia. The conversation is extremely relevant given our current political climate where individuals in positions of power, including the President of the United States, various members of Congress, and media voices, instrumentalize Christianity to carve out an exclusive version of who is considered a real or, quote, true American. White Christian nationalism has grown. Prominent voices in the country have used Christian theology to bolster division, bigotry, and Islamophobia. Today we have Reverend Dr. Michael Woolf and Reverend Dr. Anna Piela here to talk about their new book and to help us understand the current times and the prevalence of Islamophobic attitudes amongst Christians in the country. Michael and Anna are a married clergy couple who co-founded Challenging Islamophobia Together Chicagoland, an interfaith solidarity initiative dedicated to confronting anti-Muslim hate. Both are ordained American Baptist pastors. They are deeply rooted in the Christian tradition and also believe that learning from other religions enriches and deepens their own faith. Together, they serve as co-associate regional ministers for the American Baptist Churches of Metro Chicago. Anna is also a senior writer with the American Baptist Home Mission Societies, and Michael serves as senior minister of Lake Street Church of Evanston, Illinois. Equal parts pastor, activist, and theologian, they bring faith to life through public witness and interreligious collaboration. In their new book, which we'll be discussing today, called Confronting Islamophobia in the Church, Liturgical Tools for Justice, they examine the church's role in fostering anti-Muslim prejudice. The book presents clear insights into how Christian teachings and practices have reinforced harmful stereotypes, while offering practical tools and liturgical resources to help dismantle Islamophobia. A little overview of the schedule for today. We'll begin with our speakers doing a presentation. We'll go into a moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to all of you for a Q&A portion. So please use the Q&A chat function to enter your questions. I'll hand it over to Michael and Anna now.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us. And we're very excited to talk about the book, and I'm going to share a little slideshow here. And thank you for that introduction. So this is the book that we're here to talk about. And as Mubashir said, we are bringing together sort of different strands of theology and activism and things that we've cared about for many years. And we want to start with Islamophobia, as you just said, is a pretty major problem and sort of a growing problem in the United States. So Randy Fine is a congressperson that says something horrific and Islamophobic generally every month or every couple of weeks. I picked one of these headlines. But the thing is not that he is super powerful in Congress. The thing is that he's very popular in right-wing circles online, and he's kind of an influencer in that way, and channeling people towards more sort of radical views. And so he is sort of prominent in that way. And I just wanted to draw attention to the fact the way Islamophobia intersects with all the sorts of different things that we're seeing with the erosion of our pluralistic democracy in favor of white Christian nationalism. So there was an Eritrean imam that died in ICE custody in December, for instance. It was one of 4 people that died that week in ICE custody, and he was denied medical care. And the thing I put to Christians regularly is, imagine if that were a pastor. I don't think you would have been able to escape that headline. It would have been a dominant sort of news story. Instead, it was something that you had to go and look for. So Islamophobia intersects with our ongoing immigration crisis, immigration enforcement crisis, I should say, and also with anti-Blackness, as we see in the Somali community in Minnesota. But it intersects with a bunch of the issues that we are dealing with as a society here in the United States, and will continue probably to deal with for a long time.
And so we've been looking at a variety of polls, a variety of surveys measuring Islamophobia. They're all kind of they're showing that there's no debate. It's it's obvious Islamophobia is rising, especially since 2023. And so here, this is one of my, I think this is one of the most useful research tools here, the Islamophobia Index. This was created by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is a research organization based in Dearborn, Michigan. And so they're using this research tool to measure systemic Islamophobia, by which I mean the general sort of scaffolding that upholds structural Islamophobia, which is policies. It's laws that are being introduced, like, for example, structural Islamophobia, the so-called Sharia ban, which is legislation that has been introduced in, I think, about 15 states so far, and many more are sort of looking at that. I think Missouri is actually currently considering enacting one. And so, the Islamophobia index is a number that is assigned from 0 to 100, and people who participate in the survey are asked to indicate their degree of agreement with 5 Islamophobic stereotypes related to women, violence, compatibility with so-called Western values. And so basically, we've got a number for the general public in the United States. It has risen by 8 points from 25 to 33, and that's the purple line that you may see here in this graph. So that's a hefty increase. Jews, who are the group, religious group for whom it has changed the least. For them, in the Islamophobia index rose from 17 to 19. And I should say, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding looks at the results by faith tradition as well as other groupings. So here we can basically see for every faith tradition how the Islamophobia index is fluctuating. For us, the very, very important warning was that for all Christian groups who were surveyed, Islamophobia rose sharply. The group for whom it rose the most was white evangelicals, from 30 to 45, so by 50% in the space of 2 years. For Catholics, from 28 to 40, so 12 points. And then general Protestants, which includes what we call a mainline Protestants, like American Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and so on. And that was also a rise, maybe not as sharp, but I think it was around 8 points, from 22 to 30. To different degree, but among Christians, Islamophobia has become a huge problem. And so, for us as scholars of religion, as who are looking specifically right now at Christian-Muslim relations, it was, it was a huge red flag. Oh, something is going on. And so, we're thinking about what could have caused it. And it's not like there is a great mystery behind it, but in interest of making this presentation maybe a little bit more interactive, we have 2 questions for you. Think if you can make an informed guess, or if you can just share with us what your thoughts are about why do you think Islamophobia rose as a whole in America and so much among Christians. For transparency, I started my professional career as a sociologist of Islam, but in most literature that I'm familiar with that talks about Islamophobia, the Christian-Muslim relations, generally the tropes that we see that are still sort of alive and well in 2026, they're kind of traced back to maybe the colonialism period, where Orientalism, and when this sort of idea of subjugating the East became instrumental in actually sort of executing the colonial conquest. But this actually has a much longer history. And so if we look at the 7th century, which is when Islam emerged, we already have some sort of anti-Muslim polemics created by monastics, Christian monastics. And the first one that is recorded was written by this monk called John of Damascus. And in it, John of Damascus said that Islam is a sort of Christian heresy, in that he recognized that Islam was a monotheistic faith, but he, of course, to him, the Prophet Muhammad was an impostor, and so he basically said Islam is kind of like Christianity, but sort of changed and reached a heretic form. And so this was the first recorded one, and from then on we have a steady trickle of Christian polemics, different, and they are not necessarily scholarly. They're kind of very political. And when the first so-called translation of the Quran was produced, it was delivered specifically with the intention of having something to shoot down, having something to argue against. And it was not a honest, sort of frank translation. It was mostly paraphrased and with a lot of additions. And so the people who are sort of involved in that translation, so the benefactor, who was Bernard de Clairvaux, who was the abbot of the Abbey of Cluny, and he basically he gave this job to Robert Ketton, who was an English priest and a diplomat. He was very cosmopolitan, and he could speak Arabic. So he was tasked with this first so-called translation. The translation was super biased, and unfortunately, it formed the basis of the Christian sort of intellectual encounter. And to be clear, because we've had that question before in our talks that we gave before, we are aware of the sort of incredible intellectual exchange, and how Muslim philosophers, thinkers, and scholars were sort of engaging with the Aristotelian philosophy, and how then on the basis of that sort of philosophical exchange, Christians also entered that exchange, but that was very, we could say, elitist. It was just between scholars, and it did not really reach the masses in Europe at the time. So what the masses did sort of understand was what was communicated, through the political structures that they were surrounded by. And so writing such as polemics, there were a lot of there were also writings that were aimed at the masses, and in the later centuries they became incredibly common because of the printing press. For example, in the 16th century they were known as the Turk booklets, but suffice it to say that first biased so-called translation of the Quran informed the Europe's sort of understanding and imagination of Islam. And the father of the Reformation, Martin Luther, was not exempt from it. He was also a part. He participated in the anti-Muslim discourse of the time. He wrote a preface to the first printing of the Quran that was in the 16th century, and of course that printing was done again with the same intention of popularizing a text that has to be argued against as heretical. By that point, they didn't actually think it was a heresy, that Islam was a heresy. It was perceived as as an existential threat. There were military encounters, and so at the time of Luther, Islam was understood or presented as God's wrath, God's punishment for Europeans for not being religious enough. And so we are really interested in tracing of those tropes from the earliest time, And it is not to say that there was no violence in the Islamic Empire, or that Muslims of the time were saints. No, we are interested specifically in the genealogy of that discourse, and how it has survived until today, which has been now repackaged as white Christian nationalism. So
Yeah, if you look online and if you're on social media, you'll see something that's very curious to me, and that is that the Crusades are popular again. People post about the Crusades a lot. Our defense secretary has a Jerusalem cross with Deus Vult on his body. The Crusades are very much in popular culture in some way. What is old is new, and that is because Islamophobia is a key part of white Christian nationalism. And so obviously we don't want to just focus on right-wing folks. There's obviously Islamophobia in progressive spaces. We pastor in progressive churches, and we encounter Islamophobia in the work that we do pretty regularly. And when we did a survey of American Baptist pastors, for instance, we saw that Islamophobia was a big part of what's going on in the undercurrent. And so I'm going to toss it back over to Anna because she was the lead on this part.
yeah, so we surveyed about 120 American Baptist clergy last year, and we used questions from a survey that was done in 2015 with Episcopalians. So Episcopalians sort of led the charge on this kind of idea of measuring Islamophobia specifically among Christians, and we used those questions with permission from the original authors, with the view of possibly comparing them somewhat, keeping in mind that, of course, we're comparing different groups and also at different time periods. But it is an insight. For example, once we tally the responses, we noticed that generally Episcopalians 10 years ago were sort of better or less Islamophobic than American Baptist clergy now. I'm generalizing. It did not show up on every question, but if you look at sort of averages, they were sort of further down the path of kind of reconciliation, you could say. And so we have several numbers, but we're not going to talk about all the numbers. Here, 55% of American Baptist clergy had some formal education about Islam, either in their undergraduate degree or in seminary. But that also, shows us that 45 didn't, and so that's pretty close to a half. And so the question for us is how can you be an effective faith leader, ministry professional, without any formal knowledge of a faith that is, a faith of our neighbors that is is growing in the United States, and there are more and more interfaith, intercultural encounters where Christians have friends, spouses, co-workers of other faiths, including Islam, and so when they wrestle with questions, of moral or spiritual nature, that in a social environment, in a social context of the United States today, I just don't see how you can be effective without understanding what Islam is and what its teachings are, and being able to answer some questions from those congregants potentially. 31 of American Baptist clergy organized forums about Islam, and by forums we mean any sort of educational initiative in the congregation, like a book study group, or a Q&A answer, maybe inviting a speaker to the church to give a talk. And so we saw that there was definitely a correlation between formal education about Islam and organizing these educational initiatives. So it sort of shows us that church can be a place for learning about other faiths, but the faith leader has to have some sort of grounding foundation in knowledge. And 50% of ABC congregations partner with a non-Christian community. So we've got a lot of interfaith sort of initiatives here locally. For example, there's an initiative that is supposed to sort of address homelessness, and so different faith leaders come together and they devise solutions to these kind of local problems. And so this is pretty good, but 50% is, it's sort of a decent number, but this does not tell us actually how many of those non-Christian communities were Muslim. So from what we see around us, generally Christians are more sort of like keen or likely to partner with Jewish communities in their locales, maybe Buddhists, but the sort of inclusion of Muslim leaders in a lot of interfaith initiatives or situations or groups is like less than we would like to see. And so yeah, there's definitely work to be done for us as American Baptists. And here I just want to address this bar graph here on the left. It's kind of really small, so I don't know if people can actually read, but here we've got different theological concepts. And we asked the participants, how do you think Christianity and Islam are similar? So are they very similar, somewhat different, very different? And also we had the option no opinion. And so interestingly, the theological concepts on which our respondents thought that these two faiths were sort of the most similar was ethics and morality. So ethics, yeah, it's sort of, for me, it's a comforting thought that they thought that, because ethics and morality really is what underpins our daily actions. And so we didn't follow up on that, but we can see that, generally like social justice work, they perceived as something that both faith traditions share. The one that they thought that these two faiths differed the most was the role of women within the faith and the world. And so that, I think I want to address this. Our participants were definitely liberal skewing. So they were not evangelicals or conservatives. They were, what this group likes to describe itself as progressive. And their perception of Islam, is such that women in Islam have a kind of subservient role, which is a stereotype old as time. And when I saw this, I just couldn't believe my eyes that this is still sort of like this old chestnut is still kind of in operation, but it clearly is. And so this is where this soft Islamophobia kind of comes in. It does not manifest through hate crime or hate speech, but it manifests through silencing Muslims in the community. And also this sort of ideas that perhaps Muslim women need to be rescued. That idea is still incredibly strong, despite scholars, of Islamic studies, of scholars of religion, like arguing and writing forever about this. How much of an Islamophobic stereotype it is still quite kind of active among these progressive clergy, who do have an influence over their congregations in terms of thinking about different sort of moral problems. So here we've got like one response that was an open text response when we asked about what how could you sort of introduce interfaith education into your congregation? What would you say? And this person said that teaching about Islam would be introducing counterfeit knowledge, and they don't know Jesus. It was just like one of the most strikingly Islamophobic quotes. Here he calls any other doctrine heresy. And this shows a kind of fundamental misunderstanding that, teaching about Islam is not having people in the congregation convert to it. It's about basically having some sort of objective knowledge about the faith tradition. And so, if somebody's faith is so weak that it could be swayed by even some information about another faith, then, what are we talking about here? And if somebody's faith, Christian faith, is strong, then it should not be affected by any knowing about any other faith traditions. And these are two different things, intellectual sort of knowledge and religious belief here, in that sense. So
Yep.
handing out to Michael.
And so we were thinking a little bit in this book also about how to develop sort of theologies of holy envy. And so holy envy was a term that first came into parlance through Krister Sandal, who was a dean of Harvard Divinity School back in the 80s. And Barbara Brown Taylor wrote a very popular book in Christian theology circles for just sort of like, it's a trade book, but it's extremely popular for pastors around holy envy. And by holy envy, we mean the sort of appreciation of something in another religious tradition that awakens within us awe, or the sense that we wish that such an insight could be a part of our tradition. And so for Christians, awakening holy envy is a paramount concern, because Christians are obviously the hegemonic religious power in the United States. And the more that we are able to practice holy envy and develop theological reasons for doing so, the more that Christians can play a role in buttressing pluralism and things like separation of church and state, which were the foundations of our theological tradition in Baptists, which might seem strange because the Southern Baptist Convention is the biggest group of Baptists, and they're not committed to either these days, but historically that's been true. And so that's something that we take seriously in the book, and something that we care very much about. How do we build on those building blocks of separation of church and state and pluralism and values theologically? Because we're of the opinion that people don't really stay committed to this work in Christian circles unless there's a real theological reason for doing the work. It can't just be based in benevolence, or it's a nice thing to do, or it's trendy. It can't be any of that. There has to be real theology undergirding why it's important, why it's essential to Christian discipleship to practice this. So we take that up pretty explicitly and try to develop that scaffolding for people to be able to see. In our tradition, it's about soul competency, the priesthood of all believers, and God's delight in diversity. We try to use those as building blocks that are already present in our tradition to try to say what's present in other Christian traditions and other ways of being that could start to form sort of that scaffolding for us to enter that realm of holy envy. And so that's kind of like the theological counterweight to something like white Christian nationalism, is trying to find real theological ways of talking about how we can be players in a religiously diverse climate and continue to practice our religion and get to know our neighbors and incorporate those sort of conversations. So the basis of that is, something like Max Muller said that to know one religion is to know none. We found in our personal lives and in my ministry that my understanding of Christianity is greatly enriched by conversation with other religions. So the classic thing we do is, you can come out of seminary and not know how to talk about the Trinity at all. You can spend years and not know how to talk about the Trinity. You just hand wave it and say it's a mystery, whatever. But you really can't do that once you start engaging with Muslim, sort of classical Muslim sort of critiques of the Trinity. Then you actually have to understand what it is about your tradition and what the arguments actually are. So it can push you deeper in ways that are more nuanced and interesting to engage in your own faith. It makes me a better Christian pastor to engage with these sorts of things. So trying to articulate that and help people understand, we're not trying to convert anybody, far from it. What we're trying to say is, if you want to be a better Christian, actually being in dialogue with a rich and nuanced dialogue partner and seeing them as a peer tradition is going to help quite a bit. So that's a key part of the book. And one of the ways that we do that is by saying, okay, this is a pure tradition with rich and interesting insights about God. And you ought to be conversant with it. You ought to know some texts that say this. And so there's what's called a lectionary commentary for people who are not in the Christian tradition. This is sort of the listing of readings that you follow every week in order to do in church. And so it gives an opportunity for, okay, so here's this week's reading about this, but there's also a dialogue partner here, either in Hadith or in the Quran. And so try to think together about things. And whether that makes it out into the pulpit, or that's Bible study, or that's something that someone's just thinking about, we're really of the opinion that churches are very powerful in being able to situate Islam not as and other, not as a security threat, but as a really interesting theological tradition that you ought to know about and you ought to engage with. And one of the classic ways we do that is by saying, well, hey, if you care about the birth story, which a lot of churches spend a lot of time on in Advent and Christmas, then the best nativity birth story that I know of is, and the most beautiful one is in the Quran, actually. And so trying to expose people to some of that and helping people think alongside. We use this text because most Christian clergy will be like, wow, that is very similar to the infancy gospel of Thomas, which is a classic story where people were basically writing fan fiction about Jesus's childhood and trying to say, what would it look like? But it finds its place in the Quran as well. And so that's pretty exciting for a lot of Christian clergy. So we give them a little bit of a taster on some of that sort of stuff in the book. But because we can't read it together, and there's another way that we do some of that, but that's in the book, and that's a really important sort of resource. It's actually very practical for Christian leaders and for people in Christian contexts to be able to pick this book up, learn something, but also begin a richer dialogue. And that's the resource that we wanted when we started doing some of this work. We wanted there to be an interfaith lectionary resource, and there just wasn't one ever. So we sort of made one for people, which can hopefully help, I don't know, fight Islamophobia and make a better pluralistic democracy. That's what the book's all about, honestly. And so we do have some tips for getting started for people who are more practical, right? And that's that not everyone wants to do interfaith work. So, not to get sort of offended if your chosen partner doesn't want to talk about interfaith stuff. That's okay. There are people who do, and that you should probably seek out the sort of interfaith organizations that are already in your local area that have these sort of dialogue partners. It's a great way to get started. Another way is to eat together and to share a meal together. That's a really important thing. And what we share with Christians is to be as generous a reader of the Quran as you are of the Bible. So a lot of Christian leaders specifically know all the problematic parts of the Bible, how to explain them away, and how to say it's all okay. But they're very generous. They practice a hermeneutic of generosity towards their own scripture, but perhaps are very critical of others. And so instead, we want to have people be formed to be generous readers of all sorts of texts. That would be a really good and liberating thing. And we also caution people that relationship building takes a lot of time. And so this sort of stuff doesn't happen overnight. This is a real work of a lifetime, of decades, of being able to put years into it and continuing to show up. But we think that work is really important and that it is worth doing. I think that ends our presentation, and hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about with the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. As I was listening to both of you, I recalled a time back in, I think it was 2013. I was working for an immigration lawyer, and she was very active in her church. And I believe she went to a Baptist church. And she said they were doing like an 8-week course on Islam. And I had done religious studies. I'm also Muslim. And so she was like, "Oh, would you mind coming to one of our study sessions? I think it'd be really like nice for the participants to just hear, your about your faith." And I said, "Sure, why not?" And I go there, and I had a very warm reception from everyone who was there, but I didn't feel a warm reception from the pastor. And he was more so confrontational and wanted to debate rather than understand. And it seemed like the very basics that I was talking about of Islam, of, what I believe and like the 5 pillars and what we do and so on and so forth. It seemed that was still quite of a new information, and I was wondering, what are you being taught? And it came to me as a conversation continued that was very politically driven. And I think what your book does very well is to bring it back to understanding different faith rather than so often what we hear in the discourse right now is Islam is presented as some sort of political ideology and not as a religion, as a faith practiced by billions of people around the world. And in your presentation, you talk about the genealogy of Islamophobic discourse, and you take it back to how the initial first kind of intellectual um, Christian encounter with Islam was not necessarily motivated by genuine understanding, but more so, again, of debate and confrontation and trying to prove that this is heresy, this is the wrong religion, this has been corrupted, and so on and so forth. And so often, I think, especially in the context of European colonialism and imperialism, Christianity and Christian uh, um, theology has been used to justify those missions and politically driven missions by individuals in power. And again, we see that today by individuals in power using the same sort of narratives and discourse. Michael, you mentioned, the reemergence of crusader imagery. We also the anti-Sharia legislation that's been happening, that happened 10 years ago too, in 2015. It's not a new thing. That was a big thing, but there was a huge anti-Sharia movement. They had protests across the country. There was widespread legislation, I think, in almost maybe even 30 states. There's a good graph of that by the Islamophobia Documentation Project, I believe. But yeah, I think this has been such a good, enriching conversation also to bring it back to um, just having basic knowledge of basic religious literacy and how important it is to fostering a pluralistic environment and a plural and building social cohesion. So thank you for that, just like really, really great presentation. I wanted to just a quick question. What inspired you to write the book? Was there like a particular incident, or was it just kind of your experiences within your realm of expertise, and why do you see this work as particularly necessary right now?
I think the book comes directly from our interfaith work and our conversations with different partners. And so we had conversations with clergy and in particular, with clergy in sort of our political bubble. And I remember being kind of shocked about how many sort of Islamophobic, disparaging remarks I heard. And so yeah, I just couldn't reconcile that with the general sort of gist of people's kind of identities as progressive. And yeah, the it became particularly visible after October 2023, when our Muslim partners started telling us that their Christian partners with whom they had been building relationships for years, for decades, suddenly kind of took a step back, and they did not want to get involved in any shared initiatives. And it's, the diagnosis is not very hard. This all kind of, has the root in the genocide in Gaza, and how in the United States, basically, to say anything about, opposing genocide can be perceived as anti-Semitic. And so, among Christians, there is a very, there's reticence to speak out about this horrific, genocide, because they're afraid to be called anti-Semitic. It's, I think, it's one of the reasons. But yeah, and then we realized that, perhaps there are also Christians who don't go with that flow, who trying to um, sort of maintain the relationships. And so that's how we first, we created this multi-faith action network, and that is supposed to be sort of like a core group of people who, when there is need for Christian presence, whether it's a site of a hate crime or a press conference, or a memorial service, that we can pack the room and show our support for our Muslim neighbors, specifically as Christian clergy. And so yeah, and then we thought, this is something that we observe locally, but then we had conversations further afield. I had conversations in Massachusetts with Muslim leaders, and I heard the same. And so that's how we thought, maybe if we write a book about this, and if we sort of drive the point that really sort of being conversant in Islam and having relationships with Muslim partners is a part of what we see as religious duty for a Christian, then we can sort of help address this problem on a larger scale. And so, there wasn't a resource that would help with the lectionary, like Michael mentioned. And And so we thought there isn't something like that. We need to make it ourselves. And we've both written books before. It didn't seem like a too hard a task, and here we are. But this is very connected to our actually work on the ground.
I think it's such a vital resource because so often, especially when it comes to work on Islamophobia, it is either in the academic realm or um, a very sort of for an activisty progressive audience, but you are quite limited in terms of providing resources for a religious-based audience from a religious lens. And then your book also provides tools in tackling it, which again, I think there is a lot of analysis of what Islamophobia is and how it impacts people, but sometimes there's not enough resources and tools and advice on how to tackle it and how to address it.
Right.
And so I think that that's also where your book stands out in terms of providing those resources for the reader. Um, what are, from your experiences, what are some common misconceptions or fears about Islam that you believe persist among Christian congregations today?
I guess we can draw from the survey because we did ask some clergy what they heard from the congregations had they ever witnessed Islamophobic stuff, and the one that really stuck in my
Ugh.
memory was this clergy person said, I was going to a interfaith event. It's called the Muslim Baptist Dialogue, or Baptist Muslim Dialogue. It was organized by our denomination in about 10 years ago. And so she said she announced this to her congregation. She was going away. And one of her congregants said, if you want, I can loan you a gun. You're likely to need it. You're likely to need it. And so it's just such an offhand comment. I don't know if that was meant as a joke, but I don't think that excuses it. But it just showed how the narrative of Islam as a violent faith and Muslims somehow driven by this violence. That this person thought it was appropriate to voice this to a clergy person who's going to do a professional event. It's just incredible to me. It's mind-boggling. But yeah, another comment I heard, I was talking with someone about specifically about the topic of my PhD dissertation, which focused on how Muslim women use online spaces to discuss, in Islamic teachings, discuss the Quran, the Hadith, and how these scriptures apply to their lives. And so, I was really excited to share this topic with that person, and I remember that she said, "Oh, I didn't know like that they were allowed to do this, like that they were allowed to engage in hermeneutics." And that was another, like this one of those core things that Muslim women are not allowed or unable to engage with theological work. So, again, sort of misogynistic but very, very much rooted in this idea of Muslim women's subservience. So I think violence and that kind of um, idea about a Muslim patriarchy are the key anchors that hold Islamophobia in place in Christian congregations.
I'm gonna actually take a question from the audience because I think this is something I think many people I think would struggle with in terms of talking about substantive interreligious dialogue. The individual said, it would seem that the quote time horizon element is sometimes used to silence important and timely discussions. A case in point would be the genocide taking place in Palestine. It would seem that taking time to build relationships would not help starving Palestinian children. How would you respond to the matter of, quote, building relationships for a substantive interreligious dialogue for immediate issues and concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. So the problem is you don't see sort of substantive interfaith collaboration on issues of moral important concern unless there are relationships already in place. So that's one of the reasons why we have our action network is to build those relationships so that we can speak out about stuff like the genocide in Gaza. So I think that that is really important. obviously there are issues of moral import going on all across this country and globally, but it's really hard for your first foray into interfaith dialogue with an individual or with a community to be speaking out about those issues, just because you have to build some trust, especially in the sort of areas that we're in. I wish that weren't so, but I do think that you can build some trust, and you can start talking about, and we've often started talking about, we want to build some trust and we want to build a relationship so we can tackle this. And so I think that it's possible to say, so we can tackle this, but at the same time, I don't know why any if you're just a pastor, if you're just a person representing any faith, there are plenty of reasons to mistrust you right out of the gate. And I think as a Christian, I understand all the reasons why people could mistrust me as a Christian pastor, or maybe not all of them, but I can think of quite a few. And so I think it's really important not to say that we're going to use building relationships as an excuse for why we're not going to tackle difficult topics, but we are going to say that building relationships is really important before the crises start, so that we can address them, and that when we take those time to build relationships now, even though there's not an immediate payoff right now, there can be down the line a huge payoff, so that we're actually able to mobilize and oppose the sorts of moral calamities that we see in the world. So it's not to silence, and it's not to sidestep responsibility, but it is to say it's really hard to take on evil in the world together unless you really trust each other.
But just to add one thing, it is true that it is a question that the whole interfaith world is sort of wrestling with right now. There is polarization around the genocides. There are rifts in the Jewish faith, and there are rifts among Christians about where you're going to stand and who you're going to work with. So one of our Muslim partners, their solution was to, during their interfaith iftar, they invited everybody, so regardless of their stance on the genocide. But the only people who were allowed to speak, people who had the mic, were people who were pro-Palestinian, whether Jewish, so they had a woman who was not a rabbi, Jewish woman who was a Jewish convert, but at the time it was the only Jew who would kind of fit that criterion. And so there were a lot of rabbis sitting on in that room, but they were not allowed to speak. Here, the criterion was, are you speaking out against the genocide? And it is the solution that they instituted. And, those rabbis were, the Zionist rabbis were present. They were still listening to what others had to say. And perhaps, perhaps that is a seed that, one day will take root. But yeah, they were not completely excluded. They were just not allowed to talk publicly.
Thank you for that. And yeah, Michael, I couldn't agree more. And I think Anna, your point also establishes that of like building relationships now is for a long-term sort of containing those relationships. And when crises happen, you have that strong foundation where you can address those issues rather than working on a crisis with no sort of foundation. And that creates even more I think there would be a lot of emotional and just mental labor and stress involved if you don't have that foundation firsthand. And with any foundation, with any relationship, that takes time. I think another one of our attendees has a very good question. I was wondering, why do you think there's a greater inclination to align and work with Jewish leaders rather than Muslims, although Islam could overlap very closely with Christianity?
I think that most Christian leaders don't know that, but they are familiar that the first part of the Christian Bible is the Hebrew Bible, and that there is some shared scriptural overlap, even if it's supersessionist, and so there's some comfort with that. And also, I think that there's a sense that that's a safer solution. For if you want to do interfaith dialogue, it's safer to partner with Jewish communities as a Christian pastor than it is to partner with Muslim communities, partially because people don't understand a lot about Islam, and therefore they give in to all the sort of really radical narratives that are out there in society right now. So I think that obviously anti-Semitism is a huge issue in society as well, and these two are linked. but they play out in sort of different ways, especially amongst church leaders. So I think church leaders are profoundly ignorant of the fact that there is actual overlap between Islam and Christianity, and that's a major part of the issue. And again, as Anya was talking about, the current sort of landscape as a Christian pastor, I can say this pretty well, and I've seen this many times, is that sometimes there feels like a lot of pressure post Gaza to pick a side, so, and to not be able to do interfaith relationships with multiple groups. So I think that that's something that we are trying to unpack here in Chicago, in the Chicago metro area, and we've had some success re-engaging people, right? Mm. But it is a really tough narrative to crack, and so we're hopeful the book can help do a little bit of that work in other places that we're not based out of.
Yeah, and I thought I'd just add one point. Again, it's in our work we noticed that Islam, as a sort of peer tradition, in terms of interfaith kind of relationships, for Christians, Islam is not just a non-Christian faith, like they would look at Buddhism or Judaism or Hinduism. Those are non-Christian faiths, but they're kind of perceived differently than Islam. Islam is a kind of sui generis category, in that it is different, but it's kind of a threatening difference. And here, this is just kind of a very abstract sort of thought here, but it works out in the sense that I just see time and time again about this comfort of working with non-Christian but also non-Muslim partners, and reticence to include Muslim partners in initiatives. And that's the only thing I can come up with, that just Islam is something entirely else. It's not just a non-Christian faith. It's a kind of, it's a cultural construct that does not fit neatly into just the category of a partner. And of course, that's Islamophobic, but I think that's how it's working.
Yeah, can I pick up a strand just on a couple of things that I saw? I saw that there was one question: what's sort of the part of the Bible that you use to cite that for people to engage with Islam? And then there's another question about Islam and the racialization of Islam here in America, and like how that could be used to think about in church. So when we think about the sort of ways that we want people and Christians to engage with Islamophobia, we model that on their engagement and historic engagement over the past 5 years or so, 6 years or so. A lot of denominations have been reckoning with race, and so we do consciously in some of those conversations link that to racism, Islamophobia, and racism, and we talk a little bit about that. And it's the same sort of scriptural references that we're using when we're talking about combating racism. We're also talking about Islamophobia. Of course, Islamophobia has a religious element, which can be harder to, there's obviously verses in the Bible that are like Jesus Christ is the way, and no one can come to God except through him, is like one of the verses that's in John, right? So there's obviously some things that are hindrances, and there are other things that are pro. In this way, we really just like to frame it super simply on Christian ethics about love of neighbor. So when we talk about how we treat the most vulnerable, and we situate folks, with Islamophobia, Muslims are pretty vulnerable in the United States right now. How we treat the most vulnerable for Christians is the most important ethical and religious test that we have. What we do and won't do for those who are in those sort of situations is what we do or do not do for God. So I think we try to keep it really simple on the scriptural stuff, and I think most denominations have kept it relatively simple on why they ought to care about racism too. So we often bring those two together, and we're using some of the exact same scriptural references.
Thank you for that. There's one other question. I think we have time for one more. The purpose of life for Christian nationalists becomes propagation of their race. How does mainstream Christianity correct this perceived purpose of life?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I wish mainstream Christianity would more directly correct this purpose of life. And so part of that is getting people and getting regular pastors to sort of wade into what's a politicized arena at the time. But Christianity, of course, is markedly sort of anti-family. Like Jesus is famously sort of got a lot of quotes in there about how family is going to keep you from following God, which is sort of weird that he's been aligned in American Christianity as such a pro-family sort of focus. So the focus on what it means to live the good life is what we do for others, and what sort of society and what sort of way we're going to construct our lives to be able to induce flourishing for other people. The church is supposed to be the only institution that exists not for itself but for others. This kind of idea. These ideas are everywhere in the gospel, but what you find when you politicize any religion is that it's not necessarily what the religion says, it's what it can be used for political ends. And so that's exactly what we're facing and have been facing for decades in this country, but it's ramped up a lot with white Christian nationalism. And now those same white Christian nationalists are in the highest seats of power in this country, and it's a real problem, and it's a Christian problem, right? I mean, Christians are the folks who have to speak out against it. They're the folks who have to be on record, and they have to figure that out. So I think that's really important.
I want to again add
Go
something
ahead.
to that points. Christian nationalism, people, yeah, and I like to add also Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism being a kind of foreign policy to Christian nationalism. It's not my idea. It's an idea of a colleague of mine, Perley Tor from Harvard Divinity School. And I think that really sort of makes sense how you can bring the sort of the so-called home sphere and the global sphere. And my second point is, I think it's super dangerous to just place those white Christian nationalists as some sort of radical strand, very much on the right. Christian nationalism is in the Christian mainstream, and there is a super good book that written by our colleague Brian Kaylor, and the title of that book is Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. And right off the bat, like in the introduction, Kaylor talks about how, people that we kind of think as very mainstream progressive leaders, they were actually they are exercising that, they're promoting that narrative still, and how historically mainline churches helped build it. So I really recommend it. Brian Kaylor's book. He also has a new book, The Bible According to Christian Nationalists. So he is really a good sort of source of knowledge about that, also from the inside. He's a scholar and a pastor.
I think I actually cited him in one of the works I've done on Islamophobia and Christian nationalism because the name sounds very familiar.
He's really
Um,
good.
yeah, really brilliant stuff. I mean, this conversation has been so enriching, and I think just so. I use the word relevant a lot, but it's relevant. And I think your book, which we've included a link in the chat for everyone, please be sure to check it out. I think it's such a vital and important tool in terms of addressing Islamophobia within the Christian community and also providing resources and tools on how to address it. I want to thank both Anna and Michael so much for joining us today, and for all of you for joining us, and for this very enriching conversations. And we will be publishing the recording of this webinar on our website, bridge.georgetown.edu. Please do follow Bridge on social media platforms. And I want to thank you all. Thank you everyone, and thank you Anna and Michael again for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye.